Unit 51. Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw. Introduction. Literary forms commonly develop their greatest amplitude when the nations that produce them are living through a period of heightened vitality. The vitality of England in the reign of Elizabeth I culminated in the drama of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. The dynamics of the Industrial Revolution made the reign of Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901, the great period of the novel in Britain. The Victorian age seems in many respects a golden age in literature. The roll call of some of its major authors remains an impressive summary of achievement. In the novel, Dickens, Thackeray, Anne Charlotte and Emily Bronte, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy. In non-fictional prose, Carlyle, Mill, Newman, Ruskin, and Arnold. In poetry, Tennyson, Browning, Arnold, and even Gerard Manley Hopkins. Only in drama there is a conspicuous blank until 1819 with Oscar Wilde. Contributing to a rapid rise in the popularity of literature was the growth of a money-leisured and educated middle-class reading public, and an increase in the number of circulating libraries. The expanding Victorian reading public is one of the main reasons for the bulk of Victorian writing and its repetitiveness. Another aspect that influenced the age in the transformation that the press experimented all through the 19th century. From being an instrument of internal cohesion for the middle classes, it became an instrument for diffusion among increasingly bigger sectors of population, of the values of the ruling elites, and of their interest, not exclusively political but also mercantile. When talking about these changes operated in the press in the 19th century, some historians talk of the change from a press of opinion to a press of news, or a press of information. We also say from a political press to a business press. The importance of scientific research was enormous, not only in the field of technology, but in its implications with religious beliefs and moral contents. This concept will be of great importance in Shakespearean plays, especially in Man and Superman, as we will see later. The word scientist is a mid-19th century invention. It marks an important change in intellectual history, for not merely a new word, but a new kind of man was entering into existence. By 1850, it was recognized that the pursuit of knowledge was not the same as the study of wisdom, as philosophy. Science was acquiring special techniques which were different from those of philosophy and theology, and the pursuit of knowledge could no longer afford the restraints that traditional notions and systems of belief had imposed upon it. In his books On the Origin of Species 1859 and The Descent of Man 1871, Charles Darwin revealed that living creatures in their existing forms are in fact not creatures at all, in the sense of having been created, but have taken their forms through a similar slow process of change and adaptation in an endless struggle for survival. The biological discoveries were incompatible with literal acceptance of the accounts of the creation of the world and of man in the Bible, and the belief that such a literal acceptance was indispensable to religious faith was still widespread. We must not forget the importance of the expansion of the British Empire in Victorian age. The motives that led to British control of great areas far from Britain itself were various. The commercial motive was undoubtedly the strongest at the start, and it remained very important throughout the different periods. But as time went on, it was augmented by missionary influence and by strategic considerations. Victorian drama. Early Victorian drama was a popular artistic form, appealing to a kind of uneducated audience that demanded emotional excitement rather than intellectual subtlety. Nevertheless, vivacious melodramas did not hold exclusively possession of the stage. The mid-century saw lively comedies by Dion Boucicault and Tom Taylor. In the 1860s, T.W. Robertson pioneered a new realist drama, though we will have to wait until the last decades of the 19th century to find the outstanding decade of dramatic innovation. Oscar Wilde crowned his brief career as a playwright with one of the few great high comedies in English, The Importance of Being Earnest, in 1895. At the same time, the influence of Henry Ibsen was helping to produce a new genre of serious problems plays, such as Arthur Wing Pinera's second Mrs. Tanqueray, 1893. J.T. Grine founded the Independent Theatre in 1891 to foster such work and staged there the first plays of George Bernard Shaw and translations of Ibsen. Many writers of the Edwardian period, drawing widely upon the realistic and naturalistic conventions of the 19th century and in tune with the anti-aestheticism unleashed by the trial of the archetypal aesthete Oscar Wilde, saw their task in the new century to be an outstanding didactic one. In a series of gifted and wittily iconoclastic plays, of which Man and Superman performed 1905, published in 1903, and Major Barbara performed 1905, published 1907, are the most substantial. George Bernard Shaw turned the Edwardian theatre into an arena for debate upon the principal concerns of the day: the questions of political organization, the morality of armaments and war, the functions of class and of the professions, the validity of the family and of marriage, the issue of female emancipation. Oscar Wilde, background and youth. Oscar Wilde was born of professional and literary parents. His father, Sir William Wilde, was Ireland's leading heir and eye surgeon, who also published books on archaeology, folklore, and the satirist Jonathan Swift. His mother was a revolutionary poet and an authority on Celtic myth and folklore. After attending Pastoral Royal School, Wilde went on successive scholarships to Trinity College in Dublin and Magdalen College, Oxford, which awarded him a degree with honours. During these 4 years, he distinguished himself not only as a classical scholar, a poet, and wit, but also as a poet by winning the coveted Newdigate Prize in 1878 with a long poem, Ravenna. He was deeply impressed by the teachings of the English writers John Ruskin and Walter Pater on the central importance of art in life, and particularly by the latter's stress on the aesthetic intensity by which life should be lived. Like many in his generation, Wilde was determined to follow Pater's urging to burn always a hard gem-like flame. Nevertheless, Wilde also delighted in affecting an aesthetic pose. This, combined with rooms at Oxford decorated with objects d'art, resulted in his famous remark, "Oh, would that I could live up to my blue china." First writings. The aesthetic movement was a movement of mind or a shift in sensibility, and had its roots in earlier decades, shaped and influenced by contemporary activities in France. Its credo of art for art's sake ran against the utilitarianism and belief in the morality in art of the Victorian age, touched with melancholy and pessimism, and stirred by exotic art forms novel precepts and remote cultures, the movement achieved its measure of prominence largely through the writing of the Oxford Don Walter Pater. Anti-bourgeois, escapist, dandiacal, flamboyant, placing form before content and ever seeking aesthetic originality, the movement progressively stressed the pure sensation and defied the intensity of the moment. In the early 1880s, when aestheticism was the rage and despair of literary London, Wilde established himself in social and artistic circles by his wit and flamboyance. Soon, the periodical Punch made him the satirical object of its antagonism to the aesthetes for what was considered their unmasculine devotion to art, and in their comic opera Passion, Gilbert and Sullivan based the character Banthorne, a flashy poet, partly on Wilde. Wishing to reinforce the association, Wilde published, at his own expense, poems in 1881, which echoed too faithfully his discipleship to the poets Algernon Swinburne, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and John Keats. Eager for further acclaim, Wilde agreed to lecture in the United States and Canada in 1882, announcing on his arrival in New York City that he had nothing to declare but his genius. Despite widespread hostility in the press to the languid poses and aesthetic costume of velvet jacket, knee breeches, and black silk stockings, for 12 months Wilde exhorted the Americans to love beauty and art. Then he returned to Great Britain to lecture on his impressions of America. Mature years. In 1884, Wilde married Constance Lloyd, daughter of a prominent Irish barrister. Two children were born in 1885 and 1886. Meanwhile, Wilde was a reviewer for the Pall Mall Gazette and then became editor of Women's World in 1987 to 89. During this period of apprenticeship as a writer, he published The Happy Prince and the Other Tales in 1888, which reveals his gift for romantic allegory in the form of fairy tale. In the final decade of his short life, Wilde wrote and published nearly all his major work. In his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1891, Wilde combined the supernatural elements of the Gothic novel with the unspeakable scenes of French decadent fiction. The book highlights the tension between the polished surface of high life and the life of secret vice, a criticism of the typical Victorian double morality. Although sin is punished in the end, the book has a strong flavor of the elegantly perverse. The Social Comedies. Wilde's greatest success were in his social comedies. Within the conventions of the French well-made play, with its social intrigues and artificial devices to resolve conflict, he employed his paradoxical epigrammatic wit to create a form of comedy new to the 19th century English theatre. His first success, Lady Windermere's Fan, demonstrated that this wit could revitalize the rusty machinery of French drama. The importance of being earnest, trivial comedy for serious people was first produced in 1895. The slender plot concerns two fashionable young gentlemen, John Worthing, who is also earnest, Algernon Moncrief, and their eventually successful courtship of Gwendolen Fairfax, Cecily Cardew. More important than the plot is the continual flow of witty, uncompromisingly artificial dialogue and the characterization, especially Gwendolen's mother, Lady Bracknell. Indeed, in many of his works, exposure of secret sin or indiscretion and consequent disgrace is a central design. If life imitated art, as Wilde insisted in his essay The Decay of Lying, 1889, he was himself approximating the pattern in his reckless pursuit of pleasure. In addition, his close friendship with Lord Alfred Douglas, whom he had met in 1891, infuriated the Marquis of Queensberry, Douglas' father. Accused finally by the Marquis of being a sodomite, Wilde, urged by Douglas, sued for criminal libel. Wilde's case collapsed, however, when the evidence went against him, and he dropped the suit. Urged to flee to France by his friends, Wilde refused, unable to believe that his world was at an end. He was arrested and ordered to stand trial. The last years. Wilde testified brilliantly at his trial, but the jury failed to reach a verdict. In the trial, he was found guilty and sentenced in May 1895 to 2 years of hard labor. Most of his sentence was served at Reading Jail, where he wrote a long letter to Douglas, published in 1905 in a drastically cut version as De Profundis, filled with recriminations against the younger man for encouraging him in dissipation and distracting him from work. In May 1897, Wilde was released and bankrupt, and immediately went to France, hoping to regenerate himself as a writer. His only remaining work, however, was the Ballad of Reading Jail, 1898, revealing his concern for inhuman prison conditions. This poem is about the hanging of murderer Charles Thomas Woolridge. Wilde was himself a convict. Its harsh eloquence is in contrast to the asceticism of Wilde's earlier poems, but shows the same technical control. George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw, 1856-1950, was an Irish comic dramatist, poor novelist, literary critic, and socialist propagandist, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1925, probably one of the most influential dramatists of the age. His main inspiration was a philosophical one, in the exaltation of the intellect at the expense of the imagination, in the insistence on scientific method, on thought. We can find the reason why so much of the well-intentioned drama, a drama that provoked thought and was socially directed, this typical Shavian drama, seems so dead today. And he did so using the long rhetorical speeches in the manner of Molière. There can be little doubt that his plays stimulated, amused, exasperated, and shocked his contemporaries. First place. When Shaw began writing for the English stage, its most prominent dramatists were Sir A. W. Pinero and H. A. Jones. Both men were trying to develop a modern, realistic drama, but neither had the power to break away from the type of artificial plots and conventional character types expected by theatergoers. The poverty of this sort of drama had become apparent with the introduction of several of Ibsen's plays onto the London stage around in 1890, when A Doll's House was played in London, and the possibility of a new freedom and seriousness on the English stage was introduced. Shaw, who was about to publish The Quintessence of Ibsenism, 1891, rapidly refurbished an abortive comedy, Widower's Houses, as a play recognizably Ibsenite in tone, making it turn on the notorious scandal of slamlanderism in London. The result floated the threadbare romantic conventions that were still being exploited even by the most daring new playwrights. In the play, a well-intentioned young Englishman falls in love and then discovers that his prospective father-in-law's fortune and his own private income derived from exploitation of the poor. Potentially, this is a tragic situation, but Shaw seemed to have been always determined to avoid tragedy. The unamiable lovers do not attract sympathy. It is the social evil and not the romantic predicament on which attention is concentrated, and the action is kept well within the key of ironic comedy. The same dramatic predispositions control Mrs. Warren's Profession, written in 1893, but not performed until 1902, because the Lord Chamberlain, the censor of plays, refused it a license. Its subject is organized prostitution, and its actions turns on the discovery by a well-educated young woman that her mother has graduated through the profession to become a part proprietor of brothels throughout Europe. Again, the economic determinants of the situation are emphasized, and the subject is treated remorselessly and without the titillation of fashionable comedies about fallen women. As with many of Shaw's works, the play is within limits a drama of ideas, but the vehicle by which these are presented is essentially one of high comedy. Shaw called these first plays unpleasant because their dramatic power is used to force the spectator to face unpleasant facts. He followed them with pleasant plays in an effort to find the procedures and audiences that his mordant comedies had offered it. He followed them with 4 pleasant plays in an effort to find the producers and audiences that his mordant comedies had offended. Both groups of plays were revised and published in Plays Pleasant and Unpleasant, 1898. International importance. In Man and Superman, performed in 1905, expounded his philosophy that humanity is the latest stage in purposeful and eternal evolutionary movement of the life force toward ever higher life forms. The play's hero, Jack Tanner, is bent on pursuing his own spiritual development in accordance with this philosophy as he flees the determined marital pursuit of the heroine, Anne Whitefield. In the end, Jack ruefully allows himself to be captured in marriage by Anne upon recognizing that she herself is a powerful instrument of the life force, since the continuation and thus the destiny of the human race lies ultimately in her and other women's reproductive capacity. The play's non-realistic third act, the Don Juan in Hell dream scene, is spoken theater at its most operatic and is often performed independently in a separate piece. Shaw had already become established as a major playwright on the continent by the performance of his plays there, but curiously his reputation lagged in England. It was only with the production of John Bull's Other's Iceland, performed in 1905 in London, a provocative thrust at the Irish question, with a special performance for Edward VII. The Shaw's stage reputation was belatedly made in England. Shaw continued through high comedy to explore religious consciousness and to point out society's complicity in its own evils. In Major Barbara, performed in 1905, Shaw has his heroine, a major in the Salvation Army, discover that her estranged father, a munitions manufacturer, may be a dealer in death, but that his principles and practice, however unorthodox, are religious in the highest sense, while those of the Salvation Army require the hypocrisies of often false public confession and the donations of the distillers and the armorers against which it invades. In The Doctor's Dilemma, performed in 1906, Shaw produced a satire upon the medical professions, representing the self-protection of professions in general, and upon both the artistic temperament and the public's inability to separate it from the artist's achievement. possibly Shaw's comedic masterpiece, and certainly his funniest and most popular play is Pygmalion, performed in 1913. It was claimed by Shaw to be a didactic drama about phonetics, and its anti-heroic hero, Henry Higgins, is a phonetician, but the play is a human comedy about love and the English class system. This romantic comedy was first produced in German at Vienna in 1913. The first English production was staged the following year. The play turns on the claim made by Professor Higgins, a reputed professor of phonetics, to his friend Colonel Pickering that he could pass off a Cockney flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, as a duchess by teaching her to speak properly. She asks Higgins for lessons and he takes her as his pupil. In the course of her education, she emerges not merely as a presentable lady, but as a beautiful woman of increasing sensitivity. To Higgins, however, she is just a successful experiment. The play, as originally written, ends with Eliza asserting herself as a human being and rejecting Higgins. The film adaptation of 1938, which Shaw approved, brought Eliza and Higgins together at the end. This last version was made into the musical comedy My Fair Lady in 1956. After a wartime hiatus, Shaw, now in his 90s, produced several more plays, including Far-Fetched Fables, performed in 1950, Shakes vs. Shaw, performed in 1949, and Why She Would Not, performed in 1956, which is a fantasy with only flashes of his early Shaw. Impudent, irreverent, and always a showman, Shaw used his buoyant wit to keep himself in the public eye to the end of 94 years. His wiry figure, bristling beard, and dandish cane were as well known throughout the world of his plays. When his wife, Charlotte, died of a lingering illness in 1943 in the midst of World War II, Shaw, frail and feeling the effects of wartime privations, made permanent his retreat from his London apartment to his country home at Ayot St. Lawrence, a Hertfordshire village, in which he had lived since 1906. He died there in 1950. The most significant British playwright since the 17th century, George Bernard Shaw was more than merely the best comic dramatist of his time. For some of his greatest work for the stage, Caesar and Cleopatra, the Don Juan in Hell episode of Man and Superman, Major Barbara, Heartbreak House, and St. John, have a seriousness and prose beauty unmatched by his stage contemporaries. His development of a drama of moral passion and of intellectual conflict and debate, his revivifying the comedy of manners, his ventures into symbolic farce and into a theater of disbelief helped shape the theater of his time and after. A visionary and mystic whose philosophy of moral passions permeates his plays. Shaw was also the most trenchant pamphleteer since Swift, the most readable music critic in English, the best theatre critic of his generation, a prodigious lecturer and essayist. By bringing a bold critical intelligence to his many other areas of interest, he helped mold the political, economic, and sociological thought of three generations. Bibliography: Albert E., History of English Literature, Nelson, Boch, 1967, A Literary History of England, London, Routledge and Kegan Paul. Bestard G., 1980, Introducción a la Literatura Inglesa, Madrid. Burgess, 1974, English Literature, Essex Longman. Drabble, The Oxford Companion to English Literature, Oxford University Press. Ford, The New Pelican Guide to English Literature, Harmondsworth Penguin. Gilly, Longman, Companion to English Literature, London Longman. Grelet, An Introduction to English Literature, Paris Hachette.